Okay, welcome everybody. This is actually one of our first ever, I think we've done the hybrid webinars, but I am the co-director of the center, John Vandelant, and the other co-director is Jamie Cruz, and we'll be your hosts for Making an Impact with INCORE, so welcome. So today's webinar, we're gonna start with an INCORE demo. That INCORE demo, it'll be a little bit techy, but then we'll come back to the science and the actual physics and data behind what you're going to see in Jupyter notebooks and things like that. So that'll be about a 15-minute demo alternating. We'll go into some testbed science presentations for 3 of the 6 testbeds, Galveston, Seaside, and Lumberton. And then the explanation of functionality, metrics, and how that leads us into the ability to optimize for these communities. And then talking about community partnerships, and then how to use INCORE, get an account, an invitation to join the Slack channel, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. And I just want to say also, we're thrilled to have everybody virtually, and we have about 45, 50 people here in the room as well. We have presenters that will be coming up to the podium, and then we have some presenters that will also be virtual, so they're scattered around the world actually. And so I think we're all used to that now, so bear with us if there's a hiccup. And so just to start us off, so the NIST Center of Excellence for Community Resilience Center overview. In the first 5 years, we started the development of this open source INCORE platform, attempted to standardize data ontologies, and then started with the development of a comprehensive set of test beds. But then in the second 5 years after the renewal of the center, we began looking at applications of INCORE and using INCORE. So there's people using INCORE for their dissertations, there's people using it all around the world, and if you're online or you're here and you're interested in using it, definitely send an email and we'll get you set up with a free cloud account, which I'll detail in about an hour here. And then data science and architectural validation, so the V&V, very important. So everything you see here has some level of validation to it, some very, very, very solid, and some in progress. And then decision support and implementation and that tech transfer into communities, and that's the community partnerships. And so it was really knowledge creation for 5 years, and now we're in the middle of knowledge implementation. So just some background on INCORE, the Interdependent Network Community Resilience Modeling Environment. It could equally be called, the Interdisciplinary Network Community Resilience Modeling Environment. I think sometimes I accidentally write it that way because it works across social sciences, as well as economics, information science, and then the engineering and the physical infrastructure. And so we go from damage to loss, the hazard strike in a community, this disciplinary recovery and with integrated databases. And the idea is to look at alternative actions and strategies to enhance community resilience and inform planners and decision makers. So real quick, this is what's coming up in the July release. We have all sorts. I'm not going to go through it all because I want to get to the science and the demo for you, but optimization algorithms, hospital job inventories, uncertainty propagation algorithms, network school and hospital models, all sorts of great stuff. And then we'll have 6 months later, we'll have a new Mobile, Alabama test bed, which will include the port. And so with that, I will pass to Zhong Li from the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. Zhong.
Thank you, John. I'm going to give you the INCORE update and demo today. As you know, the INCORE has a lot of capability, so we picked some of the highlighted features for today. First is we improved the INCORE documentation system using Jupyter Book. And secondly, you're going to see demo how to acquire census data using PyINCORE data package. And thirdly, building damage analysis with a retrofit strategy. Fourthly, lastly, is a various visualization can be done with a PyINCORE Viz package. For information, the demo is available through the Jupyter Notebook on our documentation page. And also, you are interested in previous demos we have a YouTube video you can look at. So first, INCORE documentation system. We improved it using Jupyter Book. It actually helped us to nailing down our documentation using Markdown page or Jupyter Notebook format, which means it's much easier to edit. It's much easier to bring the examples and tutorials in the documentation system. And as you know, when you release the software, we also add new documentation for each analysis. And then we work with the researchers, we identify good tutorial and tips, we create those documentation on the page too. And lastly, we also add all those workshop materials on our documentation system. So here is a quick demo. So this is a landing page of INCORE, and you can see on top of the menu, there's a user guide. Click on that and INCORE manual. And this is a new system, so different look and feel. And then you can see the main page in the middle, and your left side has this content you can navigate to. We currently reorganize a little bit of content too. You can also download the page if you want to, the PDF. And let's go into some of the example page. This is one example of a refrigerator curve and mapping object tutorial. Good thing is right side, it also shows the sub-content of each page. So you can very easily navigate to different things. Another thing you notice is when you mouse over to this code, you can see the little icon up there. So you can copy the code right away. And so that you can cut and paste on your code to work with the example. You can also search. So you can search a data set. You can see that all those pages with the data set keyword. So click on this tutorial. You can see data set is all highlighted. And also you can work on this. Same way you can copy the code you like. And you can follow this Jupyter Notebook, or you can download the Jupyter Notebook. You could do that with the current documentation system. And then lastly, there is an important thing is one is testbed notebooks. Under the example notebook, we have a Galveston, Joplin, Lumberton, Seaside testbed is already available here. You can look at it, and also the workshop documentations and Jupyter Notebook you can download. So please visit the documentation page. There's a tons of information here. And you can use a search capability. Hopefully you can find the right information for this. So this is a one page about our hazard workshop notebook here. And there are tutorials and things like that. I'm gonna move on to the next. Next one is the census data. As you know, Census Bureau, they deploy a census data API, which means that this is a web service. So if you know how to use a web service, you can connect to that through the REST service and download data. But there's a lot of documentation you need to go through. So what we've done with Nathaniel is INCORE data package we created, and we start to add some of the data utility into this package. So the census data package, you are able to download the data, and then you can see that those analysis already using those data you can download and create input data for it. So here is the demo. So it mentions that INCORE data has a class called census util. So we're going to import that one. And also this support all those census data APIs. So we follow that API support. So import it first. And the next one you can see that is you need to know FIPS code for each location. FIPS code can be state, county, or city, or census tract and things like that. So you are able to identify FIPS code give them state name and county name. And then thirdly, you can download the data. So let's import the package. And then let's find the FIPS code for Illinois, Champaign County, Illinois. So you can see that here, and then run. And it gives you FIPS code. So first 2 digit is state, and the last 3 digit is county code. So you can use that in your variable in the code like this. And then you can also pick the parameter. This example shows you that that parameter shows number of homes that built before 1939. And then this is one of the product from AC5, which is a 5-year estimate, ACS 5-year estimate. And then we're gonna download the census tract level. And this is a method in year 2010. And then run it. And then it connects to the census API and then create the 2 format. One is a JSON format, another one is a data frame format. Let's look at data frame. So now you see that all the census tract within the Champaign County, and then there's a column shows the number of buildings built before 1939, and also give the all other information along with it. So you can use that to convert it into other things. Let's look at the counties Fort Collins belong here, so Colorado. And then you can also run this code, shows you the fifth code, same way. Run it. And then it shows that the fifth code here, so first 2 digits, state, 3 digits, county, we're gonna do year 2016. This case, we're gonna look at estimate total vacants of the buildings. And then this one gives you in the census tract level. And you run it, it also, we are able to look at in data frame format. So you can see that similarly, all the census tracts and all those data from the Census Bureau data. The last example is, this one is actually used in our analysis in testbed. It's a Galveston County in Texas, and this one is used for housing recovery analysis. So we already work with the researchers, and then we identify that those are 4 variables currently used for housing recovery analysis. So same way we identify the fifth code, and you can see there are occupancy state estimate and also margin of error and vacancy status estimate total for regional, recreational and occasional use, and also that variable margin of error too. So using those parameters, same way, it generates the data and we are able to look at all this data available. Now you could use these tables, plug into our INCORE analysis. This is another format in the JSON. Next demo is building damage analysis with retrofit strategy. When we work with researchers, we identify that people want to incorporate the retrofit strategy for each building. They want to see that if the 10% of buildings with this type of retrofit and 20% of building this type of retrofit, what is impact to the community? So we come up with an easy way to incorporate the retrofit strategy. So now, building damage analysis, you can plug in retrofit strategy file, which is CSV file, to work with it. So I'm gonna show you the demo. So this is a building damage analysis, and for information, this is originally developed by the Yoonji Wan and Charles Nichols from University of Oklahoma. When we work with them, I think Yoonji was graciously to create a notebook for us. So we make it simplify this notebook for the demo, but it's originally from the Yoonji's notebook. Now import all the necessary modules. Now we define 2 functions to work easily on this. One is building damage analysis without retrofit. So you can see that very usual setup for building damage analysis. And then second one is building damage analysis with the retrofit data. So retrofit data is a file that defines what kind of retrofit you want to do. And you can see the line that we plug into the building damage analysis. So let's define this function. Now, the usual, we go connect to the INCORE service. Now we can look at the CSV file, which defined this retrofit strategy. So you're going to see the CSV file here. There are 2 columns. First one is a graph, the global user unique ID, which is represent the buildings, and then retrofit method. So there is, I believe, 3 retrofit method. And then we can look at this one. It shows you some summary of this data. Shows that retrofit method number 2 has about 6,000 buildings, and retrofit number 3, there's 8,000 buildings in this example in Joplin. And then we're going to bring all those necessary data for building damage analysis now. And the important part is how this work with the current frigidity curve setting, that is a mapping set. So this mapping means that how to connect each infrastructure to the right frigidity. So you can see this rule here. First one says that archetype is number 1, retrofit method is 1, then connect to this frigidity curve. So we have this rule built into mappings now. So that's why when you run the retrofit strategy, then building damage analysis knows how to use the frigidity curve which retrofitted. So this is all shows some of the rules in mappings. Now we're ready to run the damage analysis. So this is some of hazard, tornado hazard we're going to use. We're going to show some maps, how the tornado looks like. Now we're going to run the damage analysis without retrofit first. And we want to look at specific building here. So you can see this building. So we're going to compare that building's limit state and damage state with actual retrofit happens. So this one is using the retrofit strategy you already saw, and then run the damage analysis. And then now shows that exactly same building, with the limit state and damage state, how it actually changes. You can see that some of the damage and limit state changes because of retrofits. And also we're going to look at here for average of the limit state 0, 1, 2 for entire buildings in this data set. So you can see somehow entire averages. So this is value without retrofit. And these are the value for with retrofit. So you can see these changes happens. So you could do much more visualization analysis using the output it generates from this analysis. Okay, last one is the various visualizations. So we work with the researchers, we find out there's several visualizations needed. So especially this one shows a geospatial mapping for hazard and data set, and also 2D and 3D chart for the fragility curve. So first example we're going to show you is how to use PyINCORE Viz package. So you can see last two lines here that highlighted here for the plotting and also geospatial mappings. So let's import those modules and then connect to the INCORE. And these are the data set I'm gonna use, show you in this demo. The first thing is now we're going to show you how to visualize earthquake, which is raster, this case a PGA one. So there is a method you can use it, and it shows a plot of this earthquake in PGA. And this one is Galveston's, the hurricane raster data wave heights. You can show this visualization plot also. You can also overlay that onto actual OpenStreetMap. So you can zoom in and out in this case. So you can look at the wave height, and also you can control the overlay opacity. So you can see the opacity changes, so you're able to do some more underneath the data too. Next one is tornado. You can plot the tornado in this plot. You can turn on the base map. It shows OpenStreetMap behind this plot too. Next one is we're going to visualize how to visualize data sets, a building inventory and then road data set from Shelby County in Tennessee. So we're going to download those data sets right now, hospital data and road data. And then visualize, first one is the building inventory data here. So you're going to see there's a different dots that represent hospitals and different structure types on the OpenStreetMap. The next one is, it shows that more interactive maps on the OpenStreetMaps. You can zoom in and out the road and also hospital buildings here like that. So you have more interactivity. So next one is the similar map, but difference is this one has rendered this data in the local in Jupyter Notebook. So you have a more interaction. You can click and highlight and those things within the map. And the next one is a network data set. As you know, network has arc and node. So we have the data set able to have represent both the node and links. So this display shows that all the nodes and then links in the Centerville example right now. So it shows the topology of network. Now, we're also able to create the thematic map. This case, we're going to look at census data. And the first example you see here is the one census data had a different column. So one census data set, and you pick the two columns, it generates a two thematic map on the maps, on the OpenStreetMap. So it looks like one, but you can turn on and off. You can see total household and total population. There's two layers. It's coming from the one data set, so you can create this kind of thematic maps. Next example is create a two layer from two different data sets. So one from one data set, total household, another one is population under age 16. So you can turn on and off those layers and visualization similarly in this interactive maps. And then next, you can turn on and off this. Next one is fragility curve visualization. So we have the sorry, I missed one. Here is a heat map you can also generate from the data set. So you are able to give them some radius and blur levels, and you're able to generate this kind of heat map using your data set. Lastly, visualizing the fragility curve. The first one is a 2D fragility curve, very typical, traditional fragility curve. You can visualize it. So it shows these fragility curves here, different limit states. And then the last one is 3D visualization. So we have a 3D fragility curves. So you are able to visualize it in the 3D. It takes a little time because of 3D, like that. So that's the end of demo today. And these are the INCORE resources. We have a landing page and documentations and source code available on GitHub and also conda packages. And there's email address for support. Thank you. So next, Jamie is going to present about testbed.
Thank you, John. Good morning to everyone out there in cyberspace and here in Colorado. I have the pleasure of transitioning to looking at how all of this great software, data, and integrated algorithms can be applied within community test beds. So we'll be starting with Galveston and then looking at other test beds within the center as well. So I'm representing a broad set of researchers across the center who have been working on integrating data and algorithms within Galveston, Texas. This testbed launched a couple of years ago with a primary focus on Galveston Island with a population of over 50,000 people, but also looking at interesting questions with respect to connection to the mainland and to the broader Galveston County. This testbed was established in order to address several interesting questions related to the impacts of multi-hazards in coastal settings, to consider interdependent infrastructure systems, and to leverage social scientific data that had been collected in the aftermath of past storms like Hurricane Ike. This is integrated in order to evaluate what we're referring to as hybrid metrics of resilience, or those that require coupling across physical and social systems. I want to take you through some of the data that you'll find existing in INCORE with respect to data and algorithms applied within Galveston. For example, with respect to hazards within the web tools, you'll see pre-populated storm simulations. These represent hindcasts of past events like Hurricane Ike, or return period events or synthetic storm events that have associated data, for example, storm surge, elevation, wave height, wind speed, etc. And these can be used when coupled with that inventory data, damage and restoration models for the built environment and coupled social systems. And this color coding just starts to give you an idea of some of the data and models that already exist in INCORE and those that you might expect to see soon in future releases. You'll also see in future releases economic systems modeling within Galveston as well. So I want to walk you through two simple policy demonstrations or questions that we might leverage INCORE to probe in a testbed region like Galveston. I'll walk you through some of the existing data and models that exist within INCORE that are used to address some of these questions. For example, initial description of built and social systems with respect to residential buildings, transportation infrastructure, critical facilities, and housing unit and address point inventory data sets. These are coupled with some of those example storm simulations that were noted and fragility models that exist within the DFR3 services and INCORE. Beyond evaluating physical damage to these assets, we're also looking at coupling with social systems, for example, population dislocation following storm events and recovery in terms of not only physical infrastructure systems, but things like housing and household recovery that refer to people returning to those households after the events over time. So the first policy lever that we'll explore relates to elevating buildings. And you could think of this through two different lenses. One perhaps with respect to looking at grants for mitigation at the individual household level, or another through a lens of looking at potential future codes and standards changes with respect to required elevation. And we're looking at a simple increment, this delta H of elevating buildings, blanket across the region, but exploring how that impacts not only the physical damage to the housing, but also cascading effects, for example, dislocated populations. So this just shows on the left-hand side the map of that damaged and non-functional building set, and on the right-hand side a plot of how that increments as we raise building elevation requirements or mitigation. You can see this disaggregated in terms of tenure status, for example, renter or owner-occupied buildings and how they're influenced in terms of dislocated populations. We can further couple this with models such as housing and household recovery models. And this allows us to explore over time what the status of residents might be in terms of being, for example, in temporary housing or shelters, or returning to permanent housing. This example shows one snapshot in time about a year after the event, and the number of people that still have not returned to permanent housing, disaggregated by sociodemographic data. So this can further inform potential policy or mitigation strategies. The last example that I want to show is a simple hardening of infrastructure, but at the distributed infrastructure system scale. Looking, for example, at retrofitting bridges within the transportation network and how that not only impacts physical damage, but things like connection between households or vulnerable populations and critical facilities, such as hospitals or fire stations. So the example that we're showing here explores different levels of retrofit, A through D, and how those different levels of retrofit to bridges within the network influence things like average connectivity between the 33 building clusters along Galveston Island and connection to critical facilities. We could further disaggregate this, for example, in terms of social vulnerability of those residents that are affected to inform equitable interventions. So this just shows you a snapshot of some of the types of questions we can probe with a test bed like Galveston. And we have a lot of ongoing work that looks at other infrastructure, disaggregating risks from different hazards, developing algorithms and applying them for retrofit prioritization, or looking at scheduling of interventions to influence restoration and recovery within these communities, as well as different levers such as combined social and physical policy levers. With that, I'll pass it to Dan Cox, who's online with you to look at Seaside, and John will help with our slide advancement.
All right,
Thank you, Jamie. I hope everyone can hear me okay.
we can.
Oh, perfect. Greetings from sunny Lisbon. Wish I could be there in person to see friends and colleagues again. But I'm very happy to be able to talk to everyone today about the Seaside test bed. This was a small test bed, one of the early ones, designed primarily to look at multi-hazards. And you can see the images on the screen. This is looking at earthquakes and tsunamis up in the Pacific Northwest. And we're very happy to have just finished the test bed data set. So that's now published online. So if anyone wants access to these data layers, they're welcome to have them as well. Next slide, please.
Sorry about that. We had a glitch on remote control access. Go ahead.
All right, thanks. So I'll talk about a few of the exciting projects that we have going on right now. This is work primarily by Mirshad Amini, looking at life safety modeling. And one of the big issues, what John was talking about, the retrofit of buildings, of course, we want to be able to evaluate those alternatives. But in a multi-hazard scenario, the retrofit of buildings can also have other implications. For example, when people try to evacuate, for example, from the beach to those blue triangles, oftentimes they have to cross the debris field. And so the retrofits can also have other implications for life safety. So we're trying to evaluate that using the INCORE model, also looking at effects of different population layers, tourists, nighttime, daytime populations. But essentially the trying to investigate what policies can decrease risk for life safety with these constraints of having high economic activity in these high hazard areas. So basically the beachfront. Next slide, please. So we'll go into a little bit more detail tomorrow, but this is a screenshot from more of Mirshad's work looking at how we use INCORE to calculate how much debris is being generated by some of these older buildings, and then using connectivity and different algorithms to estimate what is the change in travel speed across these debris fields, and then looking into structural retrofit and how that's going to change life safety. Next slide, please. We also have another research project. This is being led by Dylan Sanderson, looking at some of the decision support modeling, and specifically how to model changes to a community over time, like time in decades for different policy scenarios, and then coupling these changes into INCORE. So for example, the picture that you see on the screen had a large parking lot in Seaside in 1994, and then it gets upgraded to a large hotel. That's obviously going to change the risk for that community by adding large numbers of people right in the high hazard area. So we're interested in developing these types of urban growth models specifically that can create the kind of output that goes directly into INCORE to evaluate policies like retrofit, relocation, elevation, and things like that. Also change in use, for example, from high occupancy to low occupancy. And Dylan will spend a little bit of time tomorrow to talk about that in detail. Next slide, please. But here's a quick screenshot to show some of the different types of scenarios that we're looking at, for example, with respect to planning, putting caps on low occupancy seasonal rentals. So this is being considered by a lot of communities. These are VRBOs and things like that. They're considering, for example, trying to cap the number in certain towns. Relocating some of these high occupancy buildings seaward of or landward of the high hazard area, and then also looking at building codes, so trying to upgrade either owner or residential structures or some of these low occupancy seasonal rentals, and then combinations of the two. Next slide. And then one of the other things we're really interested in, we have lots of these smaller communities that are embedded in what we're considering a regional disaster. So a large subduction zone will create issues for a lot of coastal communities. And when we talk to them, one of their big issues is connectivity. So they want to know, for example, how connected are they to each other within a particular community, food security, health, education, these types of things. But then also how connected are the communities to resources, for example, from larger cities that aren't directly impacted as much by the disaster. So this has also been, again, trying to integrate some of the disaster tools from INCORE into these regional models and trying to come up, for example, with ways that we can look at recovery rates and different policies, for example, that would change those rates of recovery, both for local and regional connectivity. Next slide, please. And then finally, continuing to work with the group at Oklahoma on optimization. This is a slide we presented at the last semi-annual meeting, but basically trying to look at what are the costs of these economic retrofits with budget constraints. That is my last slide, and over to Omar for the Lumberton testbed.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. This is Omar Nofal. I'm going to present the update on the Lumberton testbed on the behalf of a big team, including the field study team, the post-hazard functionality team, and anyone that has been working on either developing the infrastructure or the surveys for Lumberton. Next slide. So the current update on Lumberton notebook. So we have the building damage analysis into the notebook right now. So this includes the hazard models, the community model, and also we developed 15 building archetypes along with their fragilities. You can scan this QR code so you can access the manual for the Lumberton notebook. Also on the social science model, we have also the housing unit allocation model is already into INCORE, and also the population dislocation models. Also for the, currently we are working on labor market allocation, which we will discuss in the post-hazard functionality session in session B. Next slide. All right, so this is the current structure of INCORE, and this is how our models are integrated into INCORE web services. So right now you can access the service and download hazard models. We have it developed for Hurricane Matthew, and also we have our 15 building archetypes along with their fragilities into INCORE right now. Also, the building analysis methodology to calculate the exceedance probability of each damage state and the probability of being in a damage state is also into INCORE web tools. And also you can use the current models into INCORE, including the social science model. We are currently working in the economic models to run the population dislocation using the housing unit allocation model. Next slide. We applied this approach like the high resolution flood risk model to Lumberton. So Lumberton is a small city within Robeson County. We have detailed information about the buildings within Lumberton. This information was collected from Google Street Map View, and others are, we got them from the North Carolina Web Map Service. Next slide. The hazard model that we used to generate the Lumberton testbed was the flooding event after Hurricane Matthew. So as we know, Hurricane Matthew happened in 2016. It started as a Category 1 in the Caribbean, intensified into Cat 4, but made landfall as Cat 1 and made severe rainfall event of 12 inches of rain on Lumberton, North Carolina. Next slide. We developed a hydrodynamic model for the flooding event after Hurricane Matthew. We used a high resolution model with a very fine mesh that allows us to capture detailed modeling, flow of the water. Next. So here's it shows how the water made its way to Lumberton, along with footage from drones capture how the water made it through one of the gaps between a railroad and also a bridge intersection. Next slide. So the hazard model is included into INCORE as a flood depth map and also as a water surface elevation. So we have all the hazard maps into INCORE, and also we have the 15 building archetypes fragilities into INCORE. Anyone can access them using them separately or apply them for Lumberton. Next slide. The approach that we developed includes overlaying the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability model, and then we use the building level analysis to account for the exceedance probability of each damage state for each building. And finally, you will able to know what is the damage state for each building, and based on this, you can do some loss analysis to calculate total losses at the building level or at the community level. Next slide. Also, on the social science models perspective, Nathaniel Rosenheim developed a housing unit allocation model. He used housing unit inventory, address point inventory, and building inventory to identify the census of the household for each building within the communities, this including the tenure, the race, ethnicity, and lots of other information about the hazard hold based on this allocation model. Next. So finally, we were able to group the household based on their ethnicity or based on the school that sends their kids to. So we can group the household information based on whatever information that we are looking at. So this is just a heat map that shows where is the allocated population within and around Lumberton in the boundaries of Robeson County. Next slide. So this is a quick video, shows how our models look like in the INCORE. Here's how to access the fragility. Basically, you can select the fragility or write my name or search for flood hazards. So you will be able to land on 15 building fragility for different building archetypes. Right now we have them as a 3 fragilities. From before it was 4, but right now we have 3 fragility curves with 4 damage states. Also, if you want to access the manual here, if you go to INCORE manual, so you can see how is the progress on the Lumberton notebook. We have the building damage, we have the housing unit allocation. Currently, we are working on post-hazard functionality, which we have a big team that working on multiple things, and I believe we will have something soon. Thanks, everyone.
Can you all hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, so I will talk about how we are actually defining functionality in INCORE and can be adopted by other researchers. Next, please. Okay, so we define functionality as the quality level and ability of a system to perform its intended functions, and that can be measured relative to a baseline level of services, which is usually defined by pre-event conditions, and that can be occupancy, commercial and organizational activities, as well as availability of utilities. In terms of functional recovery, we are using the definition of being a temporal and spatial process by which the system or system of systems achieve a level of functionality. But going back to the functionality definition, let's see different words and how we define them to be clear among different users. So first, for the system, and in the next slide, I have the definition for the system that we are adopting. So system is a group of interacting or interrelated elements that act according to a set of rules to form a unified whole. Now, next please, we have an example for different systems that can be a building, lifeline, infrastructure network, housing, organizations like business, religious institutions, but it could also be a market or economy or even the community as a whole. Now, a set of systems or a system of systems, any of those two nomenclatures can define another entity, for example, the community or the economy. Next, please. Next. One more. Yeah. So functions, how we define functions. In next, please. So functions refer to the societal purpose and uses of the system, and that also requires the availability of human capital, supplies, and so on and so forth. So in the next slide, I'm going to talk how we define community resilience, and that refers to community. That refers to a place designated by geographical boundaries that functions under the jurisdiction of a governance structures such as a city, a town, or county, and that's adopted by the NIST document. We are proposing different levels of functionality. First of all, we define full functionality as when the system recovers to provide baseline services in the prevent conditions or an improved state, and all significant repairs are completed. Then we're talking about partial functionality, and we can have different or multiple levels of partial functionality. It's up to the user, where a system recovers to provide the proportion of the baseline services with or without temporary measures. And finally, we have what we call inadequate functionality. Next bullet point. Yeah. When a system is unable to provide its intended services. So in the next slide, I have an example table that we took the definition of functionality we have, and we said, okay, how that's going to work for hospitals. And we use hospitals as a critical facility for risk categories 3 and 4. I have a couple of animations here, John, if you can go ahead. Okay, first. First, we have functionality, the first column. We define different levels. So we said, okay, let's have three partial levels of functionality varying at 30%, 60%, and 90%. Those numbers are examples. The user can define different percentages, and all should be expressed in percentage of the baseline functionality. Now, in the next, perfect. It's a combination of physical system functionality that includes envelope and contents. And if you see the three columns, we have the building performance state, where the building can either be from safe and fully operational all the way to unsafe with partial or complete collapse. We also account for utility service provided from full all the way to no service. You're going to see there that we have partial service, and that refers to service partially available or with low quality, and that can be intermittent power or power to select critical facilities, water available but under boil water notice. We have also associated the repair status, if the repairs are completed, if they range between minor, major, or even we have a complete reconstruction needed. And that's the physical system. Now, moving forward in the non-physical system functionality, for particularly the hospitals, we are accounting for bed capacity and staff capacity. And we are proposing certain percentages all the way from none to full. And those percentages are actually in line with the post-disaster functionality that Omar mentioned earlier for Lumberton. And again, I want to mention that this is just an example. We could have one partial level varying from 30 to 90. And this is up to the user in INCORE to identify that. And with that, I will pass it to Jamie to talk about core community resilience matrix.
Okay, I don't speak as quickly as my colleagues do, so bear with me. Okay, I'm Jamie Brown-Cruz. I'm a professor of economics and co-director of the center. And I was going to present to you something that should be very familiar to you after 7 to 8 years, of the swoosh diagram that is sort of the single variable representation of the relationship between time and percentage functionality. So how do we operationalize that? So that is the role of the community resilience metrics. I just want to put up there sort of what our goals are, our ideals is that they be accurate, reliable, comprehensive, scalable, affordable, and actionable. But very importantly, and it's not highlighted here, it must align with the community's goals and vision. So what we've done is we have come up with a trim set, not describing everything, but it is aligned with the NIST stability goals of population, the economy, physical services, and social services. So this is the first thing we have to do with the functionality measure is we have to establish a baseline. Either it's a static baseline as described, or it can be, as in Dan's presentation, or a stable rate of growth. So the metrics that we are using, and I'm not going to read all of these off, but the first one, and this is one that I wouldn't necessarily call a system, but a very important thermometer for community well-being, because if we don't understand what's going on with the population and the household composition, if the community is not serving those needs, people will leave and not come back. Okay, under economic stability, we have access to a lot of measures and the great work that Harvey Cutler and his crew has done to come up with community level gross domestic product. But also we're looking at household income, employment, and a Gini coefficient, which gives us a snapshot of wealth, equality, or inequality, which is very important. On social services stability, I've underlined that in Maria's presentation, she talked about sort of the hospital example, and so the staff bed availability is a decent summary measure of the functionality of that hospital system. We have something similar for the educational system with K through 12 staff bed seat availability and student-teacher ratio. Okay, the really wonderfully developed part of INCORE has to do with physical service stability, in which we're looking at the built environment system. And so we can point out the count of functional buildings by archetype. And then for infrastructure, we've concentrated on the water transportation and the electrical power network and the functionality of those systems. So you've seen some beautiful graphs, and so now you're going to see a very, very simple one, because as we move into an optimization, we have to identify what is the goal of the community. And so for a hospital community goal, it could be that their goal is to achieve or to identify and maximize the functionality at some time t after a damaging event, either simulated or real. Or we could also say that the community's goal is to say how much time, what is the minimum time that allows us to achieve a target level of functionality for the hospital system. So all of those, this is a very simple representation and single variable. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass it on to Charles so that he can describe the very challenging and complex purpose of doing the optimization.
Thank you, Jamie, for that. To understand the optimization-based decision support functionality of INCORE, it is important first to understand the role of optimization overall. First and foremost, any proposed optimization or decision algorithm tool is in fact a recommendation engine to be used by the communities and the researchers. It is a tool for risk-informed, model and data-driven decision support that is being designed to support a wide spectrum of community values. That is, some metrics are more important than others for some communities at different times, and this may change over time. Ultimately, to be successful in practice, The tool must address decision problems that are stakeholder-driven. To be a community-driven tool, there are at least 4 classes of questions to be addressed. These are already built into the INCORE framework. What is the scenario of interest? That is, which hazard or set of hazards are threatening the community's physical and socioeconomic systems? What does the community want to achieve? As we just saw from Dr. Cruz's presentation, what are their goals with respect to resilience? This might be minimizing economic loss, population dislocation, changing the recovery time and the recovery trajectory. Very importantly, what are the actions and interventions that are in scope for the community decision makers? For example, modifying codes, selecting individual buildings for retrofit or for elevation, easing permitting requirements, and many other possible actions. Finally, what are the constraints on these actions? We can't do everything for every building and for every infrastructure element we have in our communities. We may have limited budgets, limited labor pool, and we may have limited timeline. As a case study, we've attempted to provide example answers to these questions for Joplin, Missouri. The scenario is a tornado hazard threatening residential homes. It's important to note we're not looking specifically at the 2011 tornado. In fact, we're not looking at any individual tornado, but our goal is essentially to best protect, figure out a way to best protect Joplin, given limited resources, against a future tornado in which we do not know where it will strike. The community description includes information on approximately 25,000 homes in Joplin. What do we want to achieve? Well, in general, there may be many goals, some which are conflicting. For instance, we might want to minimize the immediate economic loss from a hazard, might require a very distinct intervention strategy compared to that one which will minimize the population dislocation. Here, we're considering 3 goals related to economic loss, population dislocation, and building functionality in the future after the recovery process begins. What are the actions, interventions to mitigate tornado damage? We identified 3 possible retrofit actions. Each is then analyzed to determine their effect on building fragility. And assuming a limited budget, we have to also know the intervention cost per individual building, and those values are estimated. Once the optimization is complete, we have the ability to identify and visualize the optimal allocation of the limited resources that meet the community-defined objectives. The color coding on the map shows which individual groups of buildings throughout the city should be retrofit to different levels. We generate multiple solutions to capture the wide spectrum of community metric focus. The effect of each is then quantified to support trade-off and cost-benefit analyses. The distinct solutions support distinct goals. Ultimately, the goal is for INCORE to incorporate a large array of decision possibilities as relevant to specific communities given their profile with respect to their internal capabilities, risk tolerance, long-term benefit analysis, all at different scales and considering uncertainty to provide a recommendation on the optimal policy portfolio that meet the community goals, which can be evaluated with respect to their risk and potential impacts over the long term. I will now pass the presentation on to Dr. Sarah Hamaday to discuss how we are going about partnering with communities. And John, I believe, will be advancing the slides.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
We can.
Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about what we are doing to bring all of this great work to the communities for actual use in their planning activities for disaster resiliency. Next slide, please. We have identified 2 big missions, I will say, for the partnership between the center and user communities. And I want to make a distinction between users. Here we're talking urban planners, policymakers, code specialists in communities as users, as opposed to the researchers and modelers who would be using INCORE. So we have 2 major missions, 2 major goals here. Number 1, we are excited, we can't wait to put INCORE into actual use by communities to support their everyday planning, their everyday design of policies for, let's say, elevation, for retrofitting policies, or investment decisions. And we are offering two major tools. Number one, of course, INCORE, the outputs of the INCORE models. And number two, the process-based, the hazard agnostic process-based NIST Community Resiliency Planning Guide for Building and Infrastructure, which for short we are calling Playbook. INCORE provides the models and model outputs, and the Playbook provides the step-by-step planning process or the framework. This is what we're offering to the communities. What we are going to get as COE during this process, we are using this as a pilot, because as INCORE modules are being developed, both the science and the visualization, formatting, and everything about the models, we want to see what is useful, what is not useful, what works for end user communities, and what does not work for them, so that we can make this more aligned for a wide range of communities and community users to work with. And I want to just to give a quick reminder, Dr. Coolio just gave a very nice definition of community. We use the word community here to refer to a jurisdiction, if you will, a city or a county for the most part. Next slide, please. So when we when we were inviting our potential community partners for this use of INCORE, pilot use of INCORE, we provided three distinct as the highlights of what can be provided for them through this process. Number one, what we thought was very attractive to the communities was the fact that INCORE was going to and is going to be able to help them reasonably estimate the impacts of different hazards on various dimensions of their community, on their local economy, on employment status, on social institutions functionalities, on, of course, the most obviously physical infrastructure. So without an actual disaster having happened yet, they will be able to start planning, which is a very, very big advantage for communities. Number two, we said INCORE is going to be able to help you play with and see your options through different what-if scenarios. What if we make these major investments given XYZ hazard scenario, so that they can make a range of decisions in advance of a disaster. And of course, another big advantage that was very attractive to our community partners was the ability to see the return on investments, the return on their advanced planning decisions over not just the post-disaster emergency period, but a much longer time horizon. So these three was really major in our discussions with our communities. Next slide, please. We went through a long list of community candidates with our community engagement team. We ended with 6 communities selected. You can see one of them is a county, the others are cities in terms of scale of jurisdiction. And we went through a long process of invitations, formalizing the partnerships, so on and so forth. If you go to the next slide, John, please. To start the partnership with these 6 selected committees, of course, we went through many meetings. I have listed some of them here. The important point that I want to make here is the fact that we try to be as diverse as possible. And by diversity here, I'm referring to the roles, the leadership versus technical, the fields of expertise, and the types of department representation that we try to capture in the stakeholder groups that we invited and had discussions with. You see, we have academics here, we have representatives from local NGOs, technical firms that in some cities were very active, and of course, city and county government representatives in our discussions. Next slide, please. Here, this is just a color-coded version. You don't need to read the small fonts. I just wanted to give a presentation of color-coded version of the types of representations we had. Most cities, most places, we have a big representation from local government, city or county. We have some variety in terms of how much state departments were involved in our discussions. And of course, you see academics, you see NGOs, so on and so forth. Next slide, please. The good news is we have formalized through memorandums of understandings. We have formalized these partnerships with 3 communities so far. We are very close to getting signatures with the other ones. Here you just see an example of City of Joplin. announcing to their citizens the fact that the partnership with the COE has started. Next slide, please. The mechanism that we designed for the piloting of INCORE and Playbook to happen is going to be through 6 distinct workshops. John, feel free to just click. I'm not going to cover all of this. Just looking at the title of the workshops, we have the first workshop, which has been already held early in 2022. First workshop was very much focused on resiliency metrics as the foundation of the connection between what the communities want to plan for and what the COE, what INCORE does provide in terms of model outputs. So workshop 1 was all about metrics, metrics, metrics. Workshop number 2 is going to be about the models themselves, collecting their input on their needs for specific models, which is going to be identified through the results of the metrics discussion. Next slide, please, John. The third workshop and the fourth workshop are going to be both focused on more details, more hands-on use of INCORE models. In the third workshop, we are going to work with more technical users within the communities. Let's say a hazard mitigation land use planner, let's say a GIS specialist, to get outputs from the models in INCORE and see how they can, the data formats, the visualizations, the actual translation of the outputs, how does that work for them in terms of translating into policies, translating into dollar amounts for their decisions. And workshop number 4 is going to take that one step further, sitting down and doing hands-on work with model outputs, translating those to default scenarios. Jamie Paget showed you some really nice examples of various default scenarios for elevation, for example. Sitting down and looking at those default scenarios and see how they want to incorporate those into actual decisions for their community. Next slide, please. And of course, workshop number 5 and workshop number 6. Workshop number 5 is going to be very much focused on documentation and development of the training materials. Throughout this process, we are providing lots of documentation for training. And we need to understand, did that training work for these pilot cities, these pilot communities? What do we need to change so that many other communities across the US will be able to use that? And workshop number 6 is going to be presentation of the actual plans, the actual policies, the actual translations of INCORE outputs by the communities. What are the products that came out for the communities out of this process of using INCORE along with the playbook? Next slide, please. So the first workshop has been held with 3 of our communities, as I just mentioned. The focus was very much on metrics as this foundational connecting piece between goals of the community and what we have in INCORE model outputs. And we held the first workshop virtually 4 hours each with these with the 3 partner communities: Galveston, Texas, Salt Lake City, Utah, and Joplin, Missouri. For the first workshop, we were successful in having not just the core resiliency team, we call it core resiliency team, and these are the 8 to 10 people in each community that are a combination of decision makers and technical users of INCORE app, community user app in each city, but also a broader representation of local officials and leaders in each community who would be setting visions, who would be not so much involved in day-to-day use of INCORE community user app, but setting the vision for resiliency planning. Next slide, please. In this first workshop, we had 4 major goals, as you can see. Of course, building a shared understanding of the partnership. The meat of the workshop was focused on building a shared understanding also of the hazards, risk, vulnerabilities, and resilience in the community. And we had 2 major tools for that. And the profile which we had developed, I will give you more details on that in a second. And the community itself, the leaders of the core resiliency team of the community, gave presentations on the most recent planning activities they have had. We had this third goal of identifying information decision support needs that they have for resilience planning. Is their biggest information or decision support need budget for planning? Is it staffing? Is it access to better data? What kind of data? Those kinds of things. And then really, I want to emphasize, most importantly, we spent a lot of time going through metrics one by one and trying to bring back metrics outputs, feedback from communities, and map those into our INCORE models. Next slide, please. For the profiles, our team had spent months going through secondary data sources for each community, building a 100+ page profile that would capture history of hazards, various vulnerabilities, using lots of census data, Bureau of Economic Analysis, so on and so forth, resiliency assets, and really the exciting part for me, and the institutional capacity for planning for resiliency in the community and the recent planning activities. Reviewed so many plans that they had developed recently. They presented this profile as one of the first things during that long workshop. We got feedback both during the workshop and written feedback from community stakeholders in the workshop. And we were able to make adjustments. Next slide, please. One of the other things that maybe the major thing that we spent time during that workshop was really the metrics workshop. Jamie Cruz just talked about the work on metrics, which captures 4 major stability areas: population stability, economic stability, physical services, and social services. What we wanted to discuss with the communities in a metric by metric basis was to make sure that these are consistent and do reflect realities of what they want to achieve, and what each community wants to achieve. What Galveston wants is different from what Salt Lake or Joplin or other communities want to have. So we presented what measures or metrics we have available in INCORE as of now. And we are using, of course, the community user app of INCORE, not the Python version. And they have a very user-friendly interface for the app. And we collected from the community stakeholders what measurable objectives they have for their community resiliency planning. Many of the times, not surprisingly, they do not call those metrics or measures. It's just objectives for them, or they don't even call it objectives. So we had to drive the meanings out of the conversations. Next slide, please. Just an example of one of the areas of metrics which we presented, and we had long small group discussions in each workshop with communities, where we went through all of these metrics. Here you see an example of household composition metrics, how that would change during time, and how they want to track progress or changes in that if they're interested in that metric. And next slide, please. So we were able to ask, thank you. They were able to ask these questions in a discussion: which of these metrics are most useful for you, for your community? Why is it that, for example, percentage of households that are displaced or returned to their pre-disaster home, why is it that that's important? And which metrics you are interested in tracking and using for your planning work, but you don't see already. You don't see that in our group of INCORE metrics. And why? Tell us why that's useful. Along with that, Zhang Li was presenting model outputs, examples of visualizations of how model outputs of INCORE user app, community user app look like, to give them an idea of what kinds of file formats they would get out of a community user app, what kinds of mapping products they can get out of that, so that they can link their measurable objectives with what products of outputs of a community user app would look like. Where we are right now, we are analyzing, we are applying qualitative analysis methods to the workshop data, we call it. Workshop data consists of all the Jamboard, small group activity, written text outputs, all the discussion notes, participant observation notes that our large team took during the workshops. we are coding those to take away, to make sure we are distinguishing all of the point by point important inputs to bring back to our modelers, to bring back to our mapping of INCORE metrics, to INCORE models with what communities said it's important to them as measurable objectives. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to John. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sarah. So to close the webinar, just wanted to inform everyone that doesn't have an account. The way to get an account is navigate to the Colo State website, resilience.colostate.edu. Click on the INCORE logo anywhere. Go into the user's manual and you can sign up for an account. They're free. You can also send us an email if you want to join the Slack channel, and that'll provide you support from NCSA at University of Illinois. You'll become part of by default, become part of the INCORE user group, and we promise we won't spam you with emails or anything like that. It's really you asking us for information. And then cloud computing's free. We have a cluster at NCSA, and you'll get a default allocation, and you can request more if you've got some really good stuff to do. So the procedure via Zoom, you can put your questions in the Q&A or the chat feature. I think we only have 1 or 2 right now. And I don't think you can raise your virtual hand. I thought we were using a different version, but and then we'll identify the next question, and we may take some questions, hopefully in the room too. We don't have a lot of time, so send an email if your question doesn't get answered, if we get that many, to resilience@colostate.edu, and we will definitely find the right person to respond to you, and hope you sign up for INCORE. So with that, let's start some Q&A. Jamie. Just give it a second.
Yeah, there we go. So Chuck Eschlager asked whether or not this presentation will be available for download.
Yeah, so we probably will be posting a PDF of the slides, so we'll get that up on the center website, and yeah, I believe that should be. It'll take us probably till Monday, just given that we're having a 2-day our 2-day hybrid SAM here for the first time in a while. So I'd say probably Monday we should have that up, and we'll check with the presenters to make sure all the slides are good to put out there. All right, any questions in the room? I know we've got a lot of the research team here. All right, we've got one from Mojtaba Harati.
Yeah, thank you for all presentation. It was great. And I want to ask a question from Omar about if right now we can generate our 3D fragility in INCORE. I mean, there is any capacity for new users?
Yes. Yeah, so this question actually should go to the NCSA, but I have some information about it. So currently, INCORE can plot 3D fragilities, but the current fragilities for flood 3D fragilities that has flood depths and flood duration is not in the format that is required to be plotted. So we need to do parameters and plot these parameters. But what we have is just like a mesh, and we have points on this mesh. So we either need to update the way that NCSA plot the 3D fragilities, or update the fragilities to be parameterized and get plotted into INCORE.
And I think Zhang Li from NCSA is going to respond also with, hey, we're getting that in there tomorrow, right, Zhang?
Yeah. I think what we could do is the visualization part, we can add some parameter that you can pick the 2 parameters and the 3rd parameter, so you are able to plot it according to that. So for information, we also provide the parametric fragilities. So there's a lot of variable you can include in the fragilities. So you want to work with us, we can help you to how to ingest that into our database.
And Zhang, maybe keep the mic for a second, correct me if I'm wrong, but for those that haven't used INCORE and are joining us virtually, or even a few here, if you you can put your own fragilities in your notebook, and you can use those. The fragility service makes it easier, and you can pull things in. But if you have your own fragilities and you want to use them, and you want to develop your own mapping algorithm for your own community, whatever you want to do, it's a computational environment. It's not really software.
Yeah, that's right. So in short, if you have your own fragility, you can create your fragility object on your Jupyter notebook in Python. You can work with it. But now you think it's ready to share with other people, then you can upload it to our service and it's available to other people too.
All right, and in doing that, if those appear in a journal paper or a thesis or a dissertation, you can put that into the notebook, and then people will continue to reference that. But then you can also publish the data set itself in Design Safe CI or something else and reference that. So there's all sorts of ways to push that data out. Jamie.
Takes a moment there. Okay, there's a couple of questions coming in. I'm going to do the second one first, and that is, can INCORE service account for the climate change and its different scenarios, or is all the simulation on the present state of hazards?
See, I think Hussam had to leave. I can answer that one. So we have the Mobile, Alabama testbed that's underway will include sea level rise, other things, and so we have so it definitely can. There's not a testbed that has that as an illustration right now, but there will be probably in the January 31st, 2023 release. And I know our team, I have somebody working on it. The Mobile testbed has a large group working on it. I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on that, that's on that Mobile team. Okay, this is...
Yeah, I think just a brief addition to that is the way that the hazard service is set up is that you can ingest simulations from external processing or simulation. So perhaps you may have run, say, a high fidelity storm simulation that accounted for sea level rise, or have a whole suite of storms where you considered things like wind speed changes. The way that INCORE is structured is that you can ingest those directly to couple with other models. So even in its current state, that can already be done, but that would need to be a bit of an external hazard simulation that's then ingested.
And one thing we didn't touch on, because we've done it in previous things, Jamie, one thing we've touched on, or we didn't touch on it today, but we've done in previous webinars, is there's the two types of hazards. There's those that are included in INCORE, which are essentially a type 1, we call it, and that's like a tornado hazard that's basically a geographic or GIS overlay of wind speeds, peak wind speeds. And then there's something like running an AdCirc1 model to, like Jamie was just talking about, and then you ingest either of those peaks. But you could do it, you could set it up in a loop and do it temporally too, and do it every 10 years or whatever you wanted. So again, computational environment, so sky's the limit.
Okay, I've got a second question.
Okay.
Can we apply INCORE to quantify the interdependencies among different systems, such as building inventory and power system, and how to do that?
So yeah, we absolutely can. We have quite a few models that are using applying interdependency amongst buildings and power and water, and the way INCORE works. Originally, we started with an adjacency matrix, but then we have hundreds of thousands of buildings, and we can operate down at the building level, and so they started to blow up without aggregation. So rather than even aggregate, which we can do too, rather than do that, it uses more of a table format where it's almost like pointers or something. So it's to get the relationships between the dependencies. There's a few models, so that's the one way or the dependency. For the interdependencies, those are a little more complicated because you have to define that feedback loop, but that can be done in your own notebook. And we have an example coming, I believe, for Seaside fairly soon.
Okay, are there questions from the floor? Otherwise, I've got another one.
And any other comments on dependency, because I'm not the one coding it, you guys are, so. All right, go ahead,
Okay,
Jim.
here we go.
Oh, okay, we've got a question in here from
Yes.
Andres.
No, I wanted to follow up on the interdependencies, and is that we also have models that consider interdependencies, for example, after a disruptive event, during the restoration process, how different interdependencies are going to affect the speed of recovery. So we're working, for example, on transportation and also different infrastructure systems, such as power, gas, and water. So yeah, those are already being implemented in INCORE as well. So
Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, this question is directed to Sarah Hamadeh. Can you share your impression about what was the most important metric parameter for the 3 communities that you have talked with so far?
Thank you. So the answer I'm going to give is before having finished the systematic coding of the data. But you said impression in the question. One of the things that I did here, and I think our colleagues do across the communities, was I'm going to put it as housing cost, because we call it in the metrics group that Jamie's group has worked on. It's called housing cost, and that goes back to affordability. And the concern that communities have for making sure that the previous experiences do not repeat themselves again. In other words, the fact that they have an affordable housing crisis, this came up very strongly in Joplin and Galveston especially, and making sure that after a disaster scenario, they wouldn't have yet another big loss of the affordable housing stock. So that stood out to me, but I can promise you when we are finished with systematic coding of the feedback, we're going to have more prominent examples.
All right, thanks, Sarah.
Okay, the next question is directed to Zhang. And the question is, are there any updates on basic analyses of the network objects like average shortest paths, cut sets, tree widths, etc.?
Yes, we are not implementing those algorithms. We're using Python library called NetworkX, but we're also working on some data set structure right now that you can represent a network using existing data. So for example, if you have a power facility data, which can be a node, and you have the power transmitted lines, can be a link, then these 2 separate data sets could combine as a network data set also. And the network data set going to include the graph, the topology definition in it. So you can very easily loading into Python library like a NetworkX or any library support that topological information graph provides.
All right, thanks, Joe. All right, do we have any no more questions online?
We have more.
Okay, yeah, we'll go to 25 after, so a couple more minutes, and then we
Okay,
better break.
this question is, does the visualization module provide a multi-dimensional plot with fragility or resilience score for a system? I think this is for Zhang as well.
Yes, I think that's a hard question because a multi-dimensional plot is depending on how many variables you want to display in the one 2D plot. We usually work on use cases, the specific examples. So if you have a special things in mind, we can come up with that kind of multi-dimensional plot depending on actual cases, because it's hard to provide a general plot mechanism for multiple dimensional plots.
All right, any last question in the room? Okay, well with that, just a reminder for anybody that doesn't have an account and wants one, sign up, and we're definitely going to be making the rounds, so we will be in a city near you with a workshop in the next 2 years, I promise, and we'll visit you in person. All right, thank you everybody for joining the webinar.